This video is lots of plants that you might use on the corner of your foundation or in between windows, or if you have really high windows or maybe a wall with no windows. So these are plants that will kind of scale to that. It's important to pick plants that will also scale to the overall size of your house. So as you're thinking about this, some of these things get quite tall and they probably don't necessarily fit with like a single story house as the corner foundation piece. So, but if you have a much taller house, you would pick one of those larger growing pieces. So, you know, pick the plants that kind of scale to the house. And this is, again, a video of plants that we wouldn't want to put in front of windows necessarily. And surprise, surprise, this is one of the plants in the video. So it's coming up. This is a good medium-sized screening plant, although pretty slow growing. So this one's upright and narrow ligustrum, not a particularly, again, fast-growing ligustrum. This is a curly leaf ligustrum, or Ligustrum coriaceum. This is not to be mistaken for a Ligustrum japonicum recurvifolium, which is the large growing ligustrum that happens to have a little bit of curl in the leaf. This is truly a curly leaf ligustrum. And it has almost a stunted or muted leaf on it that folds and turns, and is really super, super interesting. Pretty much always grows in this upright narrow habit that you see in these containers, but I can tell you from my experience growing this plant, this one's a little bit slower. So if you're looking for something that's upright and narrow, that's faster growing, they're probably something better for you. But the fact that it doesn't grow that fast means that you can probably keep this plant around 4, 5, 6 feet tall in the future, well out into the future. So once it gets to, you know, up to near the height you want to keep it, you just start flat topping it. You can shear the sides on it. This is a very slow growing kind of mutant-like ligustrum that it's probably not used as much as it should. The nursery that we're at is Panoramic Farms over in Charlotte, and this is a beautiful crop of these. They're all very similar in habit, but I wouldn't expect if you got 6 of these that you'd line them up and all 6 of them are going to behave the exact same way. It's just not that kind of plant. It's more of a specimen type plant, but it'll work as a small screening plant if you want something that's 4, 5, 6 feet tall. This is definitely another option for medium-sized screening plants. This is sky pencil holly. I've talked about it many times on the channel over the years. It's obviously an upright, narrow-growing Japanese holly, so it's not a prickly holly, also not a showy fruiting holly. It's just really meant to have this upright, narrow growth habit on it. These can be kept anywhere from the height they are when you're buying this one in this 3-gallon container that's 2 feet or so right now, all the way up to 12 or 14 feet if you want to. I think it's best not to let them get that tall though, because they do tend to splay open in the future. Snow or ice or wind can definitely hurt this plant. They're moderately fast growing and pick up speed and time, and you can just take the thing and flat top it. So you can just grab a hold of someplace on it and you know, literally hold it together and cut it off just like that at whatever height you want to keep it. These can be lined up like soldiers. Let's say you have a patio or something like that and you want to basically be able to sit down in a chair and not be seen. You know, you can keep this little wall, you know, keep a wall about like this, and then you can stand up, you know, and see over it. So some sort of low hedging, you know, plant if you wanted to do that, or again, as a single specimen plant, because it's interesting, right? Because there's not a lot of things that grow like this. But I do think, again, I would keep the height somewhere between 4 and 6 feet, something like that. That seems to be the sweet spot where the thing's able to get water up into the top of itself and then also be sturdy enough to not splay open and split in the future. Here's a Camellia sasanqua that I've had on the channel several times over the years. I actually moved a very large one at the old house. If you want to figure out how to move a large shrub, that's a Yuletide camellia that was in that video. And I've also got a single plant video on Yuletide camellia as well. This is a red flowering Camellia sasanqua that blooms near Christmas. Perfect name, Yuletide, right? For something that's red flowering near Christmas time. This is a great kind of, I would say, medium-sized camellia. It will creep up as large as you want to let it grow in time, but it has, as you can see in these containers, a slightly more upright habit. Some of the other ones we show off on the channel now are more spreading, lower mounding ones that I would put in a different video of low foundation plants or something like that. But Yuletide is a more vigorous, upright grower with a compact habit. Great dark green foliage. We're actually shooting this in February, and so it's got a little bit of a bronzing to the leaves, just a little bit, so not quite as green as it is during the growing season. But these, again, grow vigorously in time, kind of slow at first, vigorously in time, set flower buds in the summer and bloom in the fall up until about Christmas time with these red flowers. Pollinators absolutely love this one. So I like to point out to folks that a lot of times we love these full double flowers that, that are, big and full flowers, but this one has a single flat red flower, but because all the flower parts are exposed in the middle, the pollinators go crazy for this thing on warmer days in November and December. Very common screening plant that gets sold all over the place is Emerald arborvitae. This is a named selection of Thuja occidentalis, which is our native arborvitae to the northeast United States and up into Canada, but really way north of even Pennsylvania, and then very high areas up in the Appalachian Mountains where these things are actually from. But they're sold throughout, anywhere in the eastern part of the country, and I'm sure in western parts of the country as well. These are been obviously pretty sheared to keep them this narrow. They grow upright and narrow like this, but this is narrow to the extreme, right, where they've allowed a leader to form, but then they've been shearing them on the sides here to keep them narrow. So you can put these in a very narrow space, but you'll have some ongoing shearing that you'll have to do that. Otherwise, these will thicken up and be a little bit thicker in time. But great soft to the touch conifers. Don't trust these during really hot, dry periods of time. When I say they're native to literally north of Pennsylvania. And so be thinking about the fact that if it's 95 plus for a few weeks in the summertime, we see these get lost in even old established screens where a few of these will die pretty quickly. And they're not really good at letting us know. Like if you were really good at recognizing it, you could see that, that the color changes a bit in that growth on them when they're dry. But if you're not paying attention to it at all, really quickly they can succumb to drought related issues. So great plant, soft to the touch conifer. You can use it in a narrow space if you're willing to commit to some shearing on them in the future. And they can even be top pruned. We see them up in Canada, literally people making hedges out of them and keeping 7 or 8 feet tall permanently, 7 or 8 feet tall, just topping them out as well. So a lot of options with this plant, but again, when it's hot and dry, this is one you're going to put at the top of your list for making sure you're watering them. This is Rose of Autumn Camellia sasanqua. This one has a kind of a pinkish flower on it, late October, November, December, something like that. If it gets cold early, they'll carry a few buds over to maybe January or February. I'm filming this in the winter, and where the newer growth was toward the end of the season will turn a bit of a reddish color during the winter, but then also all the new growth that comes on these during the early part of the growing season has that kind of a reddish or pinkish tinge to it. It'll flush out, and when that growth hardens off a bit, that's when they start to set flower buds for the fall. And so you'll see that they completely bud up. And you'll see this one has a more upright tendency overall, and they've also been sheared on the sides just a bit. So there are, you can select for camellias based on what you want to do with them. If you want some sort of low growing spreading ones, you can kind of see that in the container typically. You can see the branches going outward like this. But if you see this vigorous upright habit on them, you're looking at a plant that'll probably get between 12 and 15 feet in height ultimately. Can be controlled between 6 and 8, something like that. But if you're in a part shade place, zone 7 to 9, and I will throw out that there are a few zone 6 Camellia sasanquas as well. If you're interested in something that's slightly more cold hardy, you need to pick up variety for that. But if you're looking for something in the part shade, low screening plant, lots of Camellia sasanquas available for that. This one's called Rose of Autumn. This is a really nice new crop of Goshiki osmanthus. Goshiki, mentioned this one many times on the channel. There's an individual plant video if you want to go back and learn more about Goshiki osmanthus. But Goshiki means 5 colors in Japanese, and so when this thing leaves out in the spring, it has kind of a pinkish red new foliage on it, and then it settles into these interesting variegations, and brighter in the newer growth and kind of darker green in the older growth on the plant. It looks wicked, like it would just eat you alive, but it's not really at all. It does flower, and it gets fragrant flowers like other osmanthus, but I've said many times it takes years for this thing to bloom for some reason. It's a little bit shy to flower, that's what I would say. initially, but once it's established in the ground for a while. One at J.C. Ralston Arboretum, around 8 feet tall. I think if you see this on a tag, you're gonna see 3 to 6 feet, somewhere in that range, typically for the height, but it will get bigger than that like any other leafy evergreen plant. You could shear these pretty hard in the late winter, early spring into either pyramidal shapes or upright narrow shapes, or however you want to keep them. And then that new foliage will come out on it, and it's super, super striking against that variegation. Here's a big crop of sunshine ligustrum. We're at Panoramic Farms over a little east of Charlotte today. They sell to garden centers and other places, but you can see how good of a grower David and his crew are here. This is an incredible crop of sunshine ligustrum. You see the yellow on them right now. They've got them under some shade, and they'll actually take them out in a little bit of sun before they leave here. They're best grown in part shade in a nursery situation, and then they're full sun out in our gardens at home. So there's some plants like that are weirdly tricky like that, where you grow azaleas in the full sun, old-fashioned azaleas in the full sun at a nursery, and then grow them in the shade at your house. Some are opposite from that. It's kind of weird. But sunshine ligustrum, great. I don't want to call it sterile, but it doesn't flower, so it doesn't produce fruit. So it's not like other Chinese privet in that way, and it has this gold coloration throughout the year. You can size control this thing ever how you want to do it. You want to make a 2-foot meatball, make a 2-foot meatball. If you want to make a 5-foot tall pyramid, make a 5-foot tall pyramid. Doesn't really matter at all. You can shape them and prune them however you want to, and it always is going to flush back out with this really bright gold coloration, which then it holds any part of this plant. And you can see these are in the shade, but where the sun's peeking around this corner right here, you see all the great color on them. So a little bit of sunlight, direct sunlight on them just keeps this rich pop of color. I've covered it many different ways over the years on the channel, and again, you can let them get 6 feet tall or a little more if you want to in the future, or size control it however you want to. But really great low screening plant, specimen plant, corner foundation plant, a container plant, all kinds of different uses you could come up with for something that has this kind of color year round. Here's a crop of gold mop cypress, and they've actually have these under a little bit of shade where they're growing them. And then they'll take the shade cloth off and they'll finish them in more sun, so they'll get much brighter coloration on them, because these get planted in the sun and the landscape. I said this before and I'll say it again. It's kind of funny because there are folks that want the gold mops that only get this tall, and then people that want the gold mops that get this tall. It's all the same plant. This plant will get as big as you want to let it get, up to 20 feet in height if you want to let it get 20 feet in height. But most people, I think, are going to use this. So this could go in a lot of different videos, right? I could put this on low foundation plants, because it could absolutely be kept 3 or 4 feet as a little round fluffy ball that's lacy, soft to the touch. I could put it in a specimen plant video, right, where you'd put this on the corner of your foundation and let it get kind of tall and narrow and wispy. I could put it as a screening plant video. I could put it as a small screening plant video, like all kinds of things that you can do with this plant. And you can just size control it, prune it however you want to prune it, or put it in a place where you can let it get big and let it really take on, basically almost becoming like a small ornamental tree in your landscape. But I love this plant. It's soft to the touch. It's easy. The more sun, the more color. Again, they're growing these in a tiny bit of shade, that's the reason you're seeing them not as bright as you normally would in my videos, if that's how it's showing up. The ones that are over here a little bit have a little bit more sun on them, and you can see a little bit more color on them. So they'll take this shade cloth off and they'll just color right up, and they'll send them out to retail, and they'll be beautiful gold mops on the tables. Here's a crop of Fatsia japonica. This is a leafy evergreen shrub, not the most cold tolerant thing in the world. Probably hardy just in zone 8 to 10 or 7B to 10. Zone 7 in a protected space, 8, 9, 10 out and open space, but part shade or shade conditions. So a lot of times when you get these big palmate type leaves on something, it's going to need some shade. Otherwise, these big giant leaves would burn for sure. This plant can get quite big. So we've seen them, 12 and 14 feet tall, but they can also be controlled 4, 5, 6 feet in height. But it's a good kind of lower screening plant in a shady space, or a specimen plant, or in a shade garden. You can size control it and keep it more like 3 or 4 feet in height if you wanted to. Really great plant, and in the fall or early winter, it gets these alien flowers on it. Looks like little alien realm balls of flowers that the pollinators absolutely go crazy for, and then sets of fruit after that. But Fatsia japonica is a very popular plant in the southeast United States, especially for shade gardens, because it has this tropical look to it. It's kind of a semi-tropical plant, but it has this tropical look. These are small plants in 3-gallon containers. You can see the leaves on them now are probably 6 inches, 8 inches across. As this plant gets some roots under it in the ground, the leaves can end up 14, 15 inches across in the future. Flower spikes on them sticking up, you know, this high above them in the fall. Blooms when nothing else is, but really great, an interesting plant. And it will, you know, in a nursery setting, I'm filming this in February. It's got a few damaged leaves over here in Charlotte from, you know, a little bit of winter damage. I consider what's happened here a free pruning, and they'll flush back out and branch from that and really get growing in the spring. This is a skip laurel. Skip laurels have an upright, narrow habit. They can reach 10 to 15 feet in height, maybe 5 to 8 feet in width, typically about twice as high as wide in the landscape. You'll see these growing in full sun and over into part shade, and a lot of people watching can grow this plant. They're hardy from like zone 5B to 9, so a lot of folks watching can grow it. Beautiful dark green, lustrous foliage year-round. Again, very, very upright habit on this plant. You can see every stem is basically just going perfectly vertical. You will maybe get a side branch out on it occasionally that needs to be cut off, but not many. And then the flowers form in the spring along a raceme, white flowers. Pollinators really love these, and it'll eventually form a black drupe later in the season. Not really necessarily grown for all those things. Most people growing these are growing them as specimen plants on the corner of a foundation or as a screen between you and a neighbor. Great for that, and it can be, you know, you can get it to the height you want it and then just start maintaining it that, you know, just by cutting it off after it flowers in the spring would probably be the appropriate time to do that, and that will flush some additional growth down here at the bottom. If you get a crazy side branch on it, you can take it off, but you can see how these, you know, grow like soldiers here in these containers. A lot of these are produced out on the West Coast and then sent to the East. They're a little easier to grow in a drier situation without overhead irrigation on them, but they do perfectly fine here for everyone in the East in the ground. This Skipconensis is the cultivar name for this, and if you ever see that ensis, it means it's from someplace. So if you see Chinensis, that means from China. This is from the Skipka Valley between Nepal and India, is actually what that is named after, which is kind of interesting. But this is a very common landscape plant that I think maybe probably should be even more common. I mean, you know, if you're looking, a lot of people are looking for screening things. I think 10 to 15 foot is a kind of a sweet spot, because you could still maintain this. You know, it doesn't get to that point where it's 30 or 40 feet tall and you kind of don't know what to do with it anymore. Skip laurel kind of hits the sweet spot for that. This is a gold thread cypress called Paul's Gold. You may know Gold Mop is the other one it's been around forever that's similar to this. This one is more heat tolerant. That was what was selected for. So these are hardy in zone 5 to 8, but you know, they're quite a bit more overall heat tolerant. And we've had one in a container at the house for maybe 3 years now. It's such a great container plant with this soft foliage and the weeping habit, and you can see how great it looks in the winter time here. I mean, this is February as we're shooting this, and it's super, super bright pop of color out here, and I think it's holding its color a little better than when we saw some gold mops. We were shooting yesterday. I think it's hold on to that yellow color just a bit better, so that may have been part of the selection as well, differentiating this one from Gold Mop. They'll get as big as you want them to let them get. So here's one. These are in the Southern Living Plant Collection. So in the Southern Living Plant Collection container, you can see how nice and full and round that plant is. You can shear this off and hold it probably at this height or a little bit bigger for years and years and years. Or you can just start to let it grow, and it will slowly creep up in kind of a pyramidal habit. So these have been obviously sheared off to be more roundish, but it's their natural growing habit is a little more like this. So if you just leave it be, it'll just keep creeping up, and it'll creep up as long as you want to let it keep growing. I had a 6-foot version of this beside my deck at the old house, and I cut it down to 3 feet. It didn't have anything on it whatsoever after I cut it, and it just flushed right back out from that. So they're actually resettable as well, which not a lot of conifers, not all conifers are that way by any stretch of the imagination, but this one can be reset in the future. But this is Paul's Gold, false cypress or Chamaecyparis, really great plant, and we've been super impressed with the heat tolerance in our Raleigh garden. This is a great low hedging plant. This is Green Mountain boxwood. Normally when you get the word green in the name, it's really referring to, we all know boxwoods are green, right? But it's most of the time it's referring to, on these hybrids and these Japanese boxwoods, that they stay green during the winter time, because a lot of the older varieties turn kind of an amber color during the winter time. This particular variety resists that. They're hardy in zone 4 to 9, so I imagine in zone 4 they're still going to get quite a bit of that off coloring during the winter time, but for those of us in the south, they'll just hold this green color through the winter. So it's a good name for it. Again, anytime you see that green in the name, that's probably what they're referring to, that it stays green 12 months out of the year. This one is a more upright, narrow habit, and you can see how they've cone shaped these, but they haven't had to do much to cone shape them. This is just how this one grows. And so this one, I'm putting this in a video with low hedging plants, okay? And it's the perfect plant for that, because it'll get 5 or 6 feet tall. So if you don't need to have a 20-foot border, this is a perfect plant for that. But this one really presents itself well for containers. If you have a container on your porch and you want something narrow that's not going to bite you when you walk by it, perfect plant for that. Also for topiaries, this one's probably amongst the best of the topiariable boxwoods, just because it's perfectly upright. It tends to select a leader very easily on its own, and it can be turned into 2-ball and 3-ball topiaries, that kind of thing. Of course, deer resistant and rabbit resistant and all the other things that boxwoods are good for, but it has a very distinct, upright, narrow growth habit. This is on the slightly slower growing scale for screening plants, for sure, but it does make a good screening plant. This is a Little Gem magnolia. It has a more upright, narrow habit than the regular Magnolia grandiflora, which can get 50 feet wide and 70 feet tall. This as well can get big in time, and I had one at the old house that probably reached 20, 25 feet in height, something like that, but it was only about 6, 7 feet in width at that time, and that's really what makes this plant kind of unique in that way. There are a couple of others, like Teddy Bear, that have probably a better brown back on the leaf. I think one thing we kind of give up on Little Gem a little bit is I don't think the color, the two-tone leaf is quite as pretty. You get the really nice lustrous green top. The leaves are much smaller. It's a dwarf plant. Everything is dwarf about it. Slightly smaller flowers, although still pretty big, just as fragrant. Slightly smaller leaves, although as the plant matures, the leaves do get a little bigger. So that leaf is probably about 5 inches long, something like that, but nothing like regular Magnolia grandiflora. But it does have a great habit. You still get the flowers. They're readily available. You can get, this is in a 50-gallon container right here, and it's about 8 feet in height. So that would give you a good start on it, because again, this is not the fastest growing screening plant. But these can definitely be part of a mixed border screen and make a great addition to the mixed border screen. The way I typically, when I'm in consultations and things and I talk about screening plants, is like, let's stand back and pick what's the most important thing to screen. And then let's get a mixed border, pick a lot of different things, and then put the things that grow the fastest or the appropriate sizes in those holes to make those holes go away faster. But the place along the line that you don't necessarily need it to be screened and super, super fast, Little Gem magnolia will be a perfect plant for that. This is a good low hedging plant, but maybe not the best foundation plant, but most of the time used as a foundation plant. This is Compacta holly, which is a very tight growing Japanese holly. You can see the habit here. They've been pruned some. These are in the largest container. This is the largest container Compacta holly I've ever seen grown. Obviously, these are for landscapers, probably replacing some Compacta hollies or wanting an instant impact on a larger house. But typically these are planted along foundations, and this plant can get 6 or 8 feet tall ultimately. Typically though, they're pruned repeatedly and over and over and over again down to 3 feet tall, because they were placed below windows on a house. But I tell you, if you plant this plant, you know, in between windows or on the corner of a foundation or as a low hedging around a patio or a place that you need a screening plant that's 6 feet tall and not, you know, and not 25 feet tall, this would be a great choice for that. So I think it definitely has a place in the landscape. But again, frequently these are bought in 3-gallon containers because they're inexpensive. They root easily. They grow pretty quick. Inexpensive in comparison to other things, and this is why they get used so frequently. But they tend to get planted on very low foundation spaces, and then as the homeowner, you're kind of married to pruning these things multiple times a year to keep them down below where you want them to grow. But given space, absolutely nothing wrong with this plant. It's green year round. It does not prickly, doesn't cause any problems, doesn't need to be pruned very often unless put in the wrong, you know, in a place where you can't allow them to get some height on them. But that is Compacta holly, and you can see the compactness of Compacta holly. Here's a beautiful crop of Osmanthus fragrans. This is a great screening plant, and I'll tell you, this is the only plant that we have in our screen that we have 3 of. So that's how much we like Osmanthus fragrans. This plant actually has fairly insignificant, what we would call kind of insignificant flowers, right? Considering that plant's 6 feet tall, that flower is teeny tiny, but it has the most amazing fragrance. These will start blooming typically late September as the nighttime temperatures cool, and then they'll bloom pretty much all winter long until early spring, except for the worst of the winter. So the worst of the winter will shut them down, typically sometime in mid-December through mid to late January. They won't be doing a whole lot of blooming, but here we are in the middle of February, and whatever remaining flowers this thing had carried through the winter are now in the process of opening. Kind of takes a warmer afternoon to really get the fragrance going. A lot of times I can't smell them all that much in the morning, but in the 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock in the evening on a slightly warmish afternoon is when you really, our entire garden can be filled with this very sweet fragrance. Super, super tight, compact growth habit, not the most cold hardy thing in the world. And when we're using plants as screening plants, frequently we're putting them out on the edge of the yard. We're really exposing them to wind and cold and other things. So, you know, this is like hardy in zone 7B to 10. I would think that out in 7B, you know, this is probably maybe a corner foundation plant for you. You know, so it's up against, you know, you're using it as to get the fragrance on it, but not as a screening plant necessarily. Probably, you know, and we're in zone 8A, and we're in a slightly protected space. Our neighborhood's not like wide open. It's wooded kind of neighborhood. Certainly by zone 8B, they can just be out in the open. But even these are in zone 8A here in the Charlotte area in the containers, and the winter's done a little bit of work on them. It hasn't hurt them badly in any way, but it's definitely off-colored them and that kind of thing. But really great plant. And again, you know, we don't have more than 1 of anything hardly. So if we have 3 of something, we definitely like it. Next up is Nellie Stevens holly. Nellie Stevens may be the most popular of the upright, pyramidal, large leaf hollies on the market. Has been for a long, long time. There are hundreds of named cultivars of upright narrow hollies, and there are some ones that stay a little bit narrower than this. These have definitely been sheared to be super narrow, and I think if you're shopping for this in a nursery, you're going to probably think that this is the exact habit, but they actually grow naturally quite a bit wider, a little bit wider than this, so more pyramidal than upright and narrow, where like Oakland or oak leaf and that golden Oakland we have at the house more naturally grow like this one's been sheared. It is a self-fruiting holly, and again, super, super popular, fast growing for nurserymen, easy plant to produce, easy plant to grow in your garden, doesn't require really anything from you. You want to have space for this plant. You can shear it and have it as a narrow piece on the corner of your foundation, but it's probably best to grow this on a larger lot as a screening plant out on the edge of your property. And we've seen them 25 to 30 feet in height ultimately, and maybe 15 feet in width, or it could be sheared and kept, and a lot of people do, 8 to 10 feet tall and 3 to 4 feet in width. Issue is, if you're putting it in an area that you're shearing it all the time, there's no great time of year to prune these things because they bloom in the spring, and then slowly but surely they get the berries on them and then carry them through the winter time. And about the time the birds take them is about the time it blooms again. So it's kind of hard to figure out exactly when to prune them. So if you're buying a Nellie Stevens holly, put it out on the edge of your property and just let the thing grow and let it do what it does, because it does become a really beautiful small ornamental tree in time. This is a really great low hedging shrub or a specimen plant on the corner of a foundation, even as a good container plant or as a outdoor Christmas tree. This is a Steed's holly, and it tends to have this more upright, narrow growth habit, where compacta is more roundish and hellerai or soft touch are, lower doming plants. This one tends to have this vertical habit on it. And so where they have been sheared a little bit to keep them this full, this is how they naturally grow on their own. And you can let this plant get as high as 10 feet to 12 feet in height if you want to let it get that tall, but you don't have to. These are not, since we're not growing these for flowers, you can prune it anytime between March and middle summer, shear it, however you want to shear it, and keep it as a little Christmas tree. You can decorate it during the winter time again, or this is a good candidate for lining up, a few of them next to a patio, or if you're on a really narrow lot and you're just trying to look for something that's maybe 6 or 8 feet tall, that doesn't take up a huge footprint. So that's the thing with this plant, is I'm getting 4.5, 5 feet of growth out of it, but it's only 2.5 feet wide, 3 feet wide to do that. You can continue to shear it like that. So you can line these up like little soldiers in a little seating area next to your porch or something like that, and have a little bit of privacy without having to eat up a lot of your ground space. This is a really interesting screening plant or specimen plant. You can grow one of these on the corner of a foundation, or you can line a few of them up in your screen or in your mixed screen. This is a Hollywood juniper. These gonna have kind of a mind of their own a little bit. I love the habit of these. This is great for coastal gardens, and just a lot of us can grow these. They're hardy for most people watching, and they kind of have a mind of their own. Sometimes they can look like they just got twisted in a circle in time. Where you take a branch like this and it turns and twists, and Tora lusa, it just twists around the plant in time and just become naturally really, really beautiful. And not a plant that I want to put in where I'm going to have to shear it a whole lot. So it really needs to be in a place where it can get large and it can do the thing that it does, which is become kind of a unique to itself, upright plant. But it does become a pretty good screening plant in time. Where it looks a little thin and wispy here in this container, it actually does become quite full. I have seen these beside a building down at East Carolina University over 30 feet tall and probably 20 feet wide. I mean, really massive plants in the future. So keep that in mind. You could at some point, shear them and cut them back some, but this one will need some space and time to become really one of the more interesting horticulture plants for ornamental horticulture. It's not going to, each of them are going to have a kind of a mind of their own. Definitely more upright and narrow overall, but in time will eat a little bit of space, so keep that in mind. Okay. This is one of my favorite upright junipers. This is Blue Point juniper. Grew these for years in my nursery. We don't have a lot of choices for blue conifers in the South, and these are hardy in zone 4 to 9, so pretty much everybody watching can grow them. But we don't have a lot, again, as you get to zone 8 and 9, we really don't have a lot of options for having blue conifers. So this is a nice blue-ish selection, not as blue as Colorado blue spruce or anything, but definitely has a blue hue to it. What's nice about growing junipers as screening plants versus arborvitae? So let's flip over to emerald arborvitae and say that plant down in the southeast is not happy in the heat. It's just really not overall happy in the heat, where junipers tend to gain drought tolerance in time and just tolerance to everything, to air pollution and to deer resistance and coastal issues and all kinds of things that other plants just don't tolerate as well. So consider using junipers if you have tougher conditions, or you're planning on planting a wall of conifers somewhere and you're not necessarily going to be able to get water to them easily. I'm probably going to go, pick some of the junipers, that Hollywood juniper, Blue Point juniper, Taylor's juniper. Those are probably going to become more resistant to some of, the abuse that we sometimes give our plants in the landscape, more than emerald arborvitae would. This is a golden Oakland holly from the Southern Living Plant Collection. This is a great upright, narrow holly. The one we have in our garden in Raleigh is now 12 feet tall or so. I had to get on a ladder the other day to prune the top of it. So I know it's right around 12 feet tall, and it's almost as narrow as this one is at 5 or 6 feet. I mean, it's only gotten to this wide. And so where a lot of these other hollies are naturally upright, and a lot of these plants are naturally upright, they do tend to add width as they get taller. This one is really, really good about staying super narrow. I really like the gold coloration, the variegation in this plant. A lot of the gold hollies or variegated hollies to me are not great looking plants. Sometimes they just look like sick hollies if I'm being honest, but this one just looks really fantastic, and it's a bright pop of color. We've got it in our part shade conditions in our Raleigh garden, but it would prefer to be out here in the full sun like these are, and these are much brighter. It's like one side of ours is really bright because it's getting more sun than the other. They're self-fruiting. You know, spring flowering, self-fruiting. I haven't seen many berries on it yet, but it really just doesn't need them at all to be a show-off in the garden. So this is going to be a great corner foundation plant or a part of a screen where you need narrower plants to make up your screen. This is dwarf Burford holly. This is a very common shrub that's used sometimes planted on foundations, and probably you know, under windows is not the appropriate place for this plant, because I actually had one of these. You can see it started there with the berries on them. So you know, it's a self-fruiting holly. It'll get lots of red berries on them, spring flowering. What I was going to say is that a lot we had one at the nursery that we used to take cuttings off of, a dwarf Burford holly, and it was 10 feet tall and 10 feet wide. And that was with us cutting on it a little bit to make cuttings on it. So over time, given space, this plant will get quite large, and I think it's probably lends itself better to be on a wall where you don't have windows. So if you have a wall where you got 15 feet of brick space and you're trying to figure out how to cover that up a bit, this would be a super tough plant for that, because it would take the heat of that maybe a brick wall would give to it. Corner foundation plant, although it's roundish and not upright, keep that in mind. There is again, roundish habit on this one. And then as a screening plant. So in a mixed border screen where you want something that's maybe 10, 12 feet ultimately, it really does slow down at that point, which is kind of nice. I don't think you'd have to do a crazy amount of pruning on this plant if you were trying to have it as a screening plant that was around 10 feet in height. This one is stretched a little bit. They had them super close together here in the nursery, and they'll do that frequently, is kind of grow them close together, then space them like this, and then in the late winter, early spring, they'll give them a little bit of haircut off the top, and this thing will fill in, and it's really kind of fast growing. With hollies, if you're trying to get hollies to grow faster, you will sacrifice some berries doing what I'm about to tell you to do, but with hollies, you can push them a little more than other plants. You can prune them coming out of winter, and that will stimulate some growth on them, and then after that growth hardens off, let's say this dwarf Burford holly grows about this much, about half of that can be taken off, and it'll grow again, and half of that can be taken off, and you can usually get away with getting at least 3 flushes on these in a single season, so you can add quite a bit of growth to them over the course of a single season if you're looking to use them as a screening plant. Again, dwarf Burford, I would say that 50% of them that have ever been planted were planted in the wrong place, but that doesn't make it a bad plant, because it just gets bigger than what the tags say. And if you put it where a space where it can really get big, you saw the berries at the beginning, the dark green foliage, really kind of a great ornamental plant that's zero maintenance in the right spot. I'm going to jump into the video real quick and remind you that over on HortTube.com, our website, we have t-shirts available. I think there's 7 different designs, something like that. And there's also, if you want to learn how to use these plants and maintain these plants in your gardens, we have 2 separate video series for that. The Learn to Garden video series is all about learning to garden, how to design with the plants, where to use them, how to create good soil in your garden. And then the Weekly Garden Planner is a week-by-week maintenance schedule and ideas for thinking about what you should be doing on literally on a week-by-week basis. So we have those 2 items over on the website as well. Back to the video. I talked about dwarf Burford holly being very roundish. This is kind of more the upright version of this same single point holly. This is needlepoint, good name for it because it is a little needle on the end of each of these that is prickly. You shouldn't have to prune it though. It should not be an issue in the garden, really. Very heavy fruiting selection, self-fruiting, so it doesn't need a male, female, it will self-fruit. But if you have multiple plants on self-fruiting things, you tend to get more fruit overall, I will say. This plant is more of an upright grower, and you can really see that in the habit here, you know, in these containers, where dwarf Burford tends to be more roundish. And I think this is kind of the plant that I think a lot of people are trying to get when they buy dwarf Burford. You know, they're trying to get kind of a medium-sized growing holly that's kind of on the narrower side. But with dwarf Burford, you get round, and with this one, this is how it grows. It's naturally going to be more upright. So it lends itself to a corner foundation planting or a screening application where you have a narrower footprint and you really can't allow the plant to get 6 feet out into your garden or something like that. So needlepoint, I think, this is a really industrial plant. Offers something to the pollinators, offers something to the birds, and not something you're ever gonna have to really spend any time maintaining. This is teddy bear magnolia. This is another narrow, upright selection of our native Magnolia grandiflora, which can get gigantic. This one is typically used in narrower applications. Always comes with this cute little teddy bear magnolia tag. That's how I can recognize it. I will say, so let's see some differences between this one and Little Jim. Little Jim, probably the most common of the narrower upright magnolias. There's a few on the market. You'll notice on teddy bear has more of a roundish leaf. It's still a football shaped leaf. It's longer this direction than it is wide, but you can see that it's kind of a little more stunted. So it's a shorter leaf. It's got a great coloration on the back. I would say much, much better overall leaf coloration than Little Jim. I think overall it has a slightly more compact habit on its own without any nursery. The nursery actually having to work on it is hard. Still gets the white fragrant flowers as we would expect on a Magnolia grandiflora. And I think overall it has better representation of the color between the top of the leaf and the bottom of the leaf, better than Little Jim. This is a really cool hedging plant right here. This is an upright growing camellia, almost grows Christmas tree-like. This one's called Spring Festival. We're seeing more and more hybrid camellias out on the market doing various things, and lots of other species that we haven't used in our ornamental landscapes a whole lot. Over the years, we're seeing more and more introductions and more crosses. So you'll see that Camellia X, Spring Festival on this one. It is, I know it's a hybrid of Cuspidata, which is one of the species, camellia species, Cupsidate or something like that. Camellia, I think, is the common name for those. But this one has was bred for very, very upright habit. And you see it's an interesting blooming time. We're filming this in February. It looks like most of these flowers won't open until late February or early March. They're starting to show a little bit of color now, a little cold weather happening, so they'll slow down a bit, and then they'll start to open up a little later. And you can see all the way down into the oldest growth here, there's flowers on this thing, and the way it's presenting itself upright and narrow like this, you'll be seeing flowers from top to bottom. And so this is like a light pink rose form, kind of a semi-double flower. I'd really like to take one of these home. We're in Charlotte filming, and this one's a little big for us to take home, but I actually want this plant because we have a narrow landscape or small landscape, and we're always looking for something to put along the edge of it that's a perfect upright narrow habit like this. So these are going to be hardy in zone 7 to 9, and a really, really interesting hybrid camellia. Here's another pretty common screening plant in the southeast United States and out west as well. There's a couple other species that typically used in the west that are a little more drought tolerant, but this is Mackie podocarpus. And if you go down to a place like Charleston, you'll see garden after garden after garden screened off with these because they have this super upright narrow tendency on their own. Pretty much all of the growth is heading straight up. And so if the houses are really close together in super narrow spaces, this is a perfect screening plant for that. Really tough. Where we think of a lot of conifers as not being heat tolerant, this one's kind of the opposite. It's not very cold tolerant, and it's super, super heat tolerant. Tolerant of coastal conditions and sandy conditions and just all kinds of conditions, as long as it doesn't get super, super cold during the winter time. New growth tends to be a little bit lighter than the old growth and creates an interesting contrast. Typically, we'll see these growing in part shade conditions down in Charleston, but they'll take lots of sun as well. We have one called Romeo at the house that has white foliage on it, but it's very slow growing in comparison to the solid green forms of Podocarpus. But this is Podocarpus mackie. Again, it's just incredibly easy, upright, pretty fast growing evergreen hedging shrub. This is Black Dragon Cryptomeria. Cryptomeria's Japanese cedar would be the common name for Cryptomeria. And this is a plant that we have very dwarfing versions of, and we probably, if you're following along with the channel back in Raleigh, we probably have 4 different varieties that stay less than, we could keep less than 3 feet in height. And then there are Yoshino Cryptomeria that can get 80 feet in height, something like that. And then this one's called Black Dragon. This one's kind of an interesting, upright, narrow one. It can be sheared pretty tight. So this would be an example of one that's been sheared pretty tight. And then there's other examples here where they're a bit thinner. I'll see some space. Every one of these is different. So interesting specimen plant for the garden for sure. Be a little bit harder to make a good, this one would, it's in a going to be in a low screening video. This one will be a little harder though to make a full screen because again, the variability between each of them. But it's definitely a plant worth having because if you're just looking for not necessarily something you just can't completely see through, but you're looking for something that's tall and narrow and interesting, this is the plant for you. Okay, so these are just, every one of them is interesting and slightly different, but always upright and kind of narrow like this. This is Florida Sunshine Alyssium. Our Florida Sunshine Alyssium at the house now is probably right around 6 feet in height, something like that. This is a great part shade or shade evergreen that's kind of ever yellow or ever chartreuse, I guess we'll call it. Really beautiful. The chartreuse color against those pink stems on this plant really make it shine. This is a plant that really lights up a part shade or shade space. And every time I film in our back garden, if this thing is in line of sight in the video, I'm getting questions about it because it just brightens up a kind of what would be kind of a shady, dark spot next to our shed in the back garden. The other thing this plant gives you is contrast. So here is an evergreen rhododendron behind it, another shade plant, right? And you see how these two things contrast against each other. So this is one of those plants that, not only stands out on its own or in a small group or in a small hedging situation where you want something that's 6 to 10 feet tall, something like that. It's also going to contrast with other things that you put in that hedge with it. This is Leanne Claera from the Southern Living Plant Collection. This is a good kind of moderate size screening shrub. And most people, when they're thinking about screening plants, if I said something got 10 to 12 feet tall, that would be about the perfect size for the plant to get. Leanne is super interesting. I'm shooting this in February and you can see a little purple tinge in the older foliage. Actually, as it starts to leaf out in the spring with new growth, it's almost red. And that red really, the entire growing season, anytime it's actively growing, has this reddish new foliage on it that settles back to this green. And again, in a colder winter, it'll turn this kind of a purple hue on the outside of it. It's a great 4-season plant. We have 3 of these in our front garden, and we're actually holding this plant in a much smaller size. So we're trying to hold this thing around 3 to 4 feet, not having any problem doing that, because every time we prune it, the new flush of growth comes out on it red again. And which is really, really striking in our garden in Raleigh. But probably the overall best use for most people in an ornamental garden is going to put this on the edge of their property, someplace where you need something that's going to become a really good, thick screening plant from top to bottom that is very low maintenance and won't eat up a lot of ground space because it's going to be more upright and narrow, and only gets about 10 to 12 feet in height, something like that, and is controllable around that height pretty much permanently in the landscape. So this is Leanne Claera. This is a screening plant we've used at our house in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is Alyssium parviflorum. We'll see Alyssium floridanum and Alyssium parviflorum. That's the two native ones we'll see out in the world of horticulture. These are native to Florida and actually parts of Georgia, but they've become locally extinct in the wild in Georgia over time. We're growing it all the way up into our Raleigh garden, so it's quite a bit more cold hardy than just Florida. Interestingly, I'm filming it in a Georgia nursery, which is kind of wild that it's actually extinct in the wild here in Georgia, in the small areas that it was native to. So it's typically native to kind of swampy areas, but these will become quite drought tolerant in a part shade or shade conditions in our gardens, but it takes a minute. So when we put this plant in the ground initially, it would just wilt every afternoon, and it just didn't matter what the temperature was outside almost. And it took a while for it to become drought tolerant. But last year, we went through a 6-week period with no rain, highs in the upper 90s. We're watering all kinds of things all over the garden, and this thing was not wilting. It was not, it has responded. It took a minute to get established, but if you have any shade conditions here in the Southeast and are looking for a good screening plant, this is it. Again, it's a little slow to get started, a little slow to get rooted in, but once it is, ours is now 10 or 11 feet tall in the Raleigh garden, and it's the backdrop to a lot of videos. And it's just a fantastic plant. Of course, deer resistant. When you crush these leaves, this is anise would be the common name for this. When you smell it, you'll know why. Very, very pungent leaves that the deer won't eat. And a lot of people, in our shady spaces where we're trying to screen the neighbor, we have deer issues. So this is a perfect plant for that. This is Cryptomeria japonica radicans. Cryptomeria japonica is just Japanese cedar. There's all kinds of different ones of these, from very small growing little dome-shaped ones to little narrow, odd-looking ones, and all kinds of things. And then Yoshino Cryptomeria has been kind of the most common of the screening plant Cryptomeria for a long time. It gets gigantic, and I mean really gigantic, 75 feet tall and really, really super wide. Radicans is slightly better version for most suburban screening that folks are doing, and this one more like 30 to 50 feet in height. Still big, quite big, right? But definitely on the narrower side than Yoshino overall. So probably if you were looking to include Japanese cedar in your screen, in your mixed border or whatever, Radicans, if you could find it, is probably a better choice than Yoshino for most people. They're just not going to need something that's 25 or 30 feet taller than this one gets. It's soft enough to the touch, so not wicked, to mess with. They tend to turn a little bit of an amber color in the worst of the winter, but most years in the deeper south they don't turn as much. You can see a little bit of that in a few of these 7-gallon containers, where just a little bit of amber color shows up in them. Definitely in colder areas, a little more of that, but really super, super easy, very fast growing screening plant. This is a brand new crop of columnar Hetz junipers, so don't judge it by what you're seeing right here in these containers. These are newly planted, but this is a really great upright narrow juniper. There's a version called Glauca, which has a bit of a blue hue to it, and then this is the kind of richer green color, again, newly potted and newly fertilized, so not as green as it would be. But this is a great screening plant for most people watching. This is going to be full sun, tough conditions, an area that if it gets dry in between watering is going to be fine. Zones 4 to 9, really, really tough plant. These can reach somewhere, let's say 12 to 15 feet in height and maybe only 5 feet in width. And for most people, that's about a really good size screening plant. You don't necessarily need anything that's 30 feet or 40 feet in height. And so this is the perfect plant for that. They can also be sheared. So they can be sheared in the future to stay narrower. So it's a great corner foundation plant, specimen plant, or in a mixed border. But I wanted to show these off, even though these is, these need a season to really start to fill out in these containers. But a really great, tough plant for most ornamental landscapes. This is Camellia X pink icicle. It is a hybrid camellia. It's often listed as Camellia japonica, but it's not actually a Camellia japonica. It does bloom when the Camellia japonicas are blooming. This is one of Dr. Ackerman's hybrids that's actually zone 6 hardy. It tends to have a slightly upright habit. I think it's Camellia williamsii and olifera, I think, is the two in the parentage for this plant. But it is a hybrid. Again, it's frequently sold as Camellia japonica because it has a japonica-like leaf and a bloom time that's similar to the japonicas. These are really out in crazy cold right now. This nursery is in the process of covering everything. These aren't even pot tight in zone 8 here at Dudley's nursery. So it's just amazing how cold hardy this camellia actually is, with open flowers when last night was 27 degrees outside, and the flowers are open on them here. So this is one of the Ackerman hybrids to be on the lookout for if you're in zone 6 or if you're in zone 7 and you want to put a camellia out in a little more open space. This is a Podocarpus macrophyllus called Emerald Flame. I think Ted Stevens was one of the first people who brought this back from Japan. It has pink new growth on it. So I'm filming this in February, and you can see the great texture of this plant. This is going to be a good screening plant in part shade conditions or sunny conditions, and reach somewhere between 8 and 10 feet in height. You know, some of the other Podocarpus like Mackie tend to be a little more vigorously upright and can get taller than that. But this one is similar to the one we have Mood Ring at the house, where this one has a pink new growth on it. It's kind of a burgundy-ish. It kind of goes through changeable colors on its way to this solid green. Of course, in the wintertime, as you can see, it's green like this. And again, we have that one at the house called Mood Ring that's in the Southern Living Plant Collection. It has a similar habit where they're going to be ultimately upright and pretty narrow and reach somewhere in the 8 to 10 foot range. But great plant, great textured plant. Here in the South, we don't have a lot of conifers that are really, really, really tough in the South. And this is a good example of one that is. May take a minute with this one, where Mackie and a couple others are just more initially rigidly upright. This Emerald Flame and the other one that we have, the Mood Ring, tend to be a little bit leggy on the way. I mean, not leggy, but kind of wispy on the way to ultimately being a very upright plant. A lot of times when we're shopping for Akubas, you'll see just solid green ones, and then you'll see gold dust available. Not a lot of other selections, but there are a ton of named ones out in the world that are super, super interesting, and we have covered several on the channel over the years. This one's called Golden King. Great name for it. Quite a bit more yellow in this one than there is in gold dust. What a great looking plant. Of course, these are for part shade or shade conditions. You can keep these pretty much any size you want to keep them. Ultimately, most of these will creep up. These gold foliage plants are slower growing, or chartreuse colored plants are slower growing, but ultimately it can creep up over 6 feet in height, but can be kept more like 3 to 4 feet in height if you want to do that. But what a great plant. Those shady spaces that have those long shadows in the fall and in the spring, these are the type of plants that really, really stand out. And if you can find plants that contrast with foliage type, you know, look at those two together. This is a Podocarpus, a macrophyllus with a gold Akuba. Here's a crop of gold dust Akuba, another great part shade or shade shrub. Gold dust tends to be more on the green side with some gold speckling, and you'll get some variation in this where you may see a center yellow stripe in it, or, you know, again, you'll see the occasional branch that's quite a bit brighter. They tend to be a little bit variable in time. You can let these get 6 or 8 feet in height in time, or you can keep them 3 to 4 feet in height. Totally up to you on how you handle these. They are moist, well-drained conditions is kind of ideal for Akuba, but they will take dry shade, which is a nice thing. If you go to the Asian garden at Ralston Arboretum, you can see tons of different variegations and non-variegated Akuba in that space, and you know, I've always loved Akuba. Again, though, gold dust tends to be one of the more common ones you'll find at retail, but more and more we're seeing some that have brighter variegations, more chartreuse color in them, some that almost look completely yellow with just a spotting of green rather than, you know, green with the spotting of yellow. But Really versatile plant for our shade and part shade areas. Sometimes you'll see this is deer resistant, and I made the mistake of saying that on a video in the past, but lots of people have deer just mow these down. So I would not put it in the deer resistant category. This is an Oakland holly. You'll see it's Ilex X Oakland. So it's a hybrid. So it's self-fruiting, and this one is actually in the process of it's just about to flower, filming this in February down in South Georgia. And then you have the old, the fruit from last year. So they kind of almost overlap. You'll get the new flowers for this season and a few remaining berries on it from last year. This one has a vigorous upright habit. You can see, in fact, they've cut the leader on this one recently. And we have a golden Oakland holly in our garden, which is the variegated version of this. A great plant as well. But this one, a lot of times when we're filming these upright broadleaf hollies like this, and you see them this thin, they've been shearing them to do that. Oakland just does this. That's the really nice thing about this is some others like Nellie Stevens would be like this if it hadn't have been pruned at all. Where this one is really, I think what people are trying to do with these things when they're putting them on the corner of their houses and things is just kind of the natural way in which Oakland holly grows. It has what looks like super spiny leaves on it, but they're actually fairly muted. You'd have to really work hard to have this leaf hurt you in some way. But again, if you're looking for a vigorously upright, narrow holly that's self-fruiting like this to put in your screen or on the corner of a foundation, something like that, Oakland holly's a good one. This is a Spartan juniper. This one is really great for heat tolerance and just tough conditions overall. So these will take full sun and are hardy in zone like 4 to 9. So pretty much like almost everybody watching this video can grow this plant. Very rigidly upright. So this is a new crop of 3-gallon Spartan junipers here, so they're a little on the small side, and they've still got them pot to pot, but they'll space these in the next week or two, and then as we're filming this in February, and they'll fill out a little bit more at the bottom and gain a little bit more height before they send them off to retail. These plants, I think one of the things that makes Spartan great is if in a mixed border screen or using 3 or 5 of these as part of your screen, you can create kind of a formal look. These will all grow like soldiers, basically. A lot of these screening plants, you need to do a little bit of work on them to have them be copies of one another. But this one is great for a formal garden, so the edge of some sort of formal garden. Ultimately reach about 15 feet in height, maybe 5 feet in width, but you could shear it a bit to keep it a little bit narrower than that. It'll bronze a little bit in the winter time or turn kind of a purplish hue in colder areas. We're filming this in South Georgia, so despite the fact that it's winter, it hasn't off-colored all that much. They don't get that much cold on them. But I've always liked this plant just because I can plant it in a container and that's what it'll do. No work had to be done from the time this was a rooted cutting until now to have it look like that and be that narrow. So there you go, that's Spartan juniper. This is robin holly, and robin is amongst my favorite upright narrow hollies. It's self-fruiting, fruits heavily, blooms heavily in the spring, and then it has probably the darkest green foliage in the ground. And in a container, I don't know that that's going to come across, and shooting a small container plant like this. I think these are 5-gallon containers. It's maybe a 4 actually. It's kind of looks like a taller than normal 3. In the ground, this one has the darkest green foliage. It's just absolutely amazing. It has a lot of what looks like wicked points on the leaves, but this is part of the selective breeding that's going on with these, where they're a little more muted. I will say probably in Oakland, they're even a little more muted than robin. So if that's a concern for you, you might go over to Oakland. But robin has great dark green foliage, a very rigid, upright, narrow growth habit, much more so than some of the older broadleaf hollies that are out on the market. I just really love this plant, and I can tell this plant apart in the ground when it's between some of the other new breeding and the narrow ones, just because it has such a really dark, rich green foliage. But this is a great plant in a mixed a mixed border for sure. And then this is a really good candidate for the corner of your foundation because it's going to have a very rigid upright growth habit. That's not going, you're not going to have to prune it away from the house all the time, right? It's just going to keep going north. The pruning you're going to have to do on it may be to slow the height down in the future, and maybe a crazy limb here or there, but for the most part, this one's going to get pretty self-maintaining as long as you've got some height, because ultimately probably it's going to get 20 feet in height or something like that, maybe 6 to 7 feet in width over time. This is a Christmas jewel holly from the Southern Living Plant Collection. We have this one in our garden in Raleigh, but we actually had it in a container for like 3 or 4 years. Really great, upright growing holly. It will get a little broader in time if you let it, but you can shear this one pretty narrow. Flowers, as you would expect in the late winter, early spring. Pollinators go, come in, pollinate them, and then you get this berry set on this variety. It's just wild how many berries you actually get on here. We're filming this in February, and this is kind of the overlap season for these hollies, where this year's flowers are starting to form, but last year's flowers are still, present on the plant with the, in the form of that red fruit there. That's Christmas jewel has a narrower leaf than some of the other broadleaf hollies. It's kind of akin to, Foster I, or Foster number 2 that we used to grow quite a bit. Foster had a slightly longer leaf than this, but a similar growth habit. It looks wicked, like you see all these points on the leaves, but they're very muted. So a lot of this breeding in these hollies now is to make these, they don't fight back as much if you have to go and do any pruning on them or anything like that. But this was a great container plant for us for 4 years. As a little Christmas tree shaped, holly in a container. And then of course it's a great corner foundation plant. And then of course any kind of mixed border screen. You could control the height and width on this one about any way you'd want to. It's not as vigorously upright as some of the other upright hollies are. So it would be easy to control this one. If you wanted it to reach 6 feet and just hold it there, you could absolutely do that. But this is a Christmas jewel holly. Here's a great screening plant in the Southern Living Plant Collection. This is a sweet viburnum called Coppertop. And as you can see here, it's late February, about to be March in South Georgia. And they're starting to put on new foliage. You can see why it's called Coppertop. Anytime this plant is actively growing, it has this really intense coppery red foliage on it. And you can prune this repeatedly during the season and continue to get it to leaf out like this. We have one of these in our Raleigh garden. These are hardy in zones 8 to 10, and you could probably get away with them in 7B in a very protected space, and you can get away with them in 8A in a slightly protected space. You want to be probably zone 8B to 10 before you put these out in where they're going to get a lot of wind, on them. They get those fragrant flowers that sweet viburnum get. Pretty long bloomed, great foliage on these, rapid growth habit once they get going. I mean, really rapid growth habit. I planted these in the old garden before I left, and in a single season, even with root competition along a wooded edge, they had grown 3 or 4 feet in a single season. This is a very vigorous growing screening plant. Full sun is probably best overall to keep it super compact, but again, I had them in part shade at the old house, and it was a great looking plant. But this is a sweet viburnum that has this additional thing where it puts on this incredible color show anytime it's actively growing. This is Spring Sonata Indian Hawthorn, and this is part of the Clean Sweep series of Indian hawthorns from the Southern Living Plant Collection. These are newer introduced Indian hawthorns that have very clean foliage. So what we've seen in a lot of older Indian hawthorn varieties, some leaf spot issues. They're in that rose family, and roses, have issues sometimes, as we know, with leaf spot issues. But this is a new series that's been introduced that are very, very clean. The foliage is just beautiful on these. Spring Sonata is going to get more like 4 to 5 feet in height, so kind of a larger mounding Indian hawthorn. A lot of dwarf Indian hawthorns out there you can keep 2 to 3 feet, but this one is good for a low hedge. Perfect plant for a low hedge or a slightly larger foundation, maybe where your windows are up a bit higher on a sunny side of your house. Spring flowering, And this one will get just absolutely covered up in white flowers as it matures. This is a small, newly planted 2-gallon pot plant, really. But as it matures, very full plant on its own. Doesn't really require anything from you to make this a perfect little 4 to 5 foot round ball at all. Spring flowers, white flowers, and then get to kind of a purplish or bluish colored berry on it in the fall. Really great ornamental plants, and we've seen them fall out of favor a bit as ornamental plants because of disease issues, but now we're seeing through some plant breeding, some plant selecting, some new ones arriving here on the market. Okay, this is Bronze Beauty Clayera from the Southern Living Plant Collection. The Southern Living Plant Collection has I don't know how many there are, probably 5, I may be off on that number, Clayera in the collection, and they do they're for various things. That Bronze Beauty has probably one of the medium-sized growers. Medium size in a Clayera is probably going to be 12 to 15 feet in height, something like that. We have Leanne and what is the other one that we have on the edge over there? Bigfoot in our garden in Raleigh. And Leanne probably stays the smallest. Again, Bronze Beauty somewhere in the middle. Bigfoot, the name is appropriate for one that's going to get big, big, big. It turns this, with the winter color on it that you were seeing up close at the beginning, is kind of a purpley bronze color. But then as the new growth starts on these, we're shooting this at the end of February. These are kind of small 3-gallon plants right now. They will grow like mad, really can grow 2 or 3 feet in a single season pretty quickly. And all the new growth on it as it's coming out from that is this bronze color. And it really has this incredible 2-tone coloration on it with the old green foliage. Then after that hardens off a bit, if you want to, in the early summer, you can go out and shear these a bit. They don't require shearing to stay full as screening plants, but they can be sheared, and that will produce a new round of color on them. And that's what we do on our Leanne Clayera at the house, because it also has beautiful new color on it, is we can just give it an extra shearing, and that creates more of that. But if you're looking for pretty fast growing screening plant that's not going to get 20 or 25 feet tall, kind of a medium-sized screening plant, Bronze Beauty Clayera is a good one. This is August Beauty Gardenia. This is one that's been on the market for a long time, and it gets some size to it. There's a lot of gardenias out on the market that are ground cover gardenias, and then a lot that are in the 3 to 4 foot range, and we'll frost-proof gardenia being one of the more common ones that are that size, or Jubilation, in that 3 to 4 foot range. And then there's August Beauty, which gets 5 to 8 feet, something like that. It can be kept smaller than that, and a lot of people do keep it smaller than that. But you can see it has a pretty upright habit overall. Really great dark green foliage on this one. Typically for us in our Raleigh garden, these would bloom sometime in May, so a little later than the other spring flowering shrubs. And they have big double white flowers on them. Not as big as tropical gardenias by any stretch that get really, really large, 3 and 4 inch flowers. But these are, let's say 2.5 inches across, very, very fragrant. Again, double flowers. They'll come into full flower all at once, just kind of almost not cover up, but lots and lots of white flowers on it. And then during the summer into fall, they'll throw out the residual flower the rest of the season. But this one has a great dark green foliage, upright habit, probably misplanted as much as any other plant, because it's going to get this big. And it tends to be, it's this big and leafy evergreen in the pot when you look at it, and it's in full flower, and you take it home, you put it under 3 foot windows, and you're pruning it forever. So put this on a corner foundation or in a low screen if you're in warm enough areas. These are hardy in like zone 7 to 10. 7A, you definitely have them very protected up against a house. 7B, a little more open space. By the time you get to zone 8, this could be in a low hedge. That's kind of the proper place for this plant, because you can see its natural habit is to be kind of rigidly upright, and it becomes a nice, upright shrub like this, unless you're having to prune on it all the time. Gardenias can come with a few problems occasionally that they can be a little finicky in our gardens. Make sure you're in a well-drained spot. That's the starter point is to make sure you plant these up high a little bit above the grade in the garden and allow them to dry out between rains and waterings. This is Ruby Loropetalum. This one's one that's been around for a long time. It has great new purple foliage on it, and then the leaves settle into this really rich dark green color, and it creates this 2-tone color in the plant. But anytime it's actively growing, it has lots of this purple purple growth on it. You see the frilly pink flowers on it. This is a witch hazel family member, so similar flower to witch hazel, and a few other members of that family that have flowers like that, including Distilleum is in that group. Ruby is interesting because Ruby, when it first came on the came out on the market and was talked about, it was 3 to 4 feet in height, on the tags, but it creeps up much bigger than that. The one that I had at the nursery before I left, the one we took cuttings off of, was over 10 feet in height. But it adds height. You see how it has this kind of weeping habit? So it adds height in a very organized manner. So branches come up and weep down. Branches come up and weep down. So it never looks bad, even if it gets bigger than what you intended. You don't have to like jump on it and prune it immediately. Like some of the old Loropetalum had these big spiky growth that coming out of the top of them where it just didn't look very good and it needed to be pruned off all the time. So I think for most people, Ruby should be thought of as a corner foundation plant or a small screening plant and allowed to get 10 or 12 feet tall. They're blooming now in February. This is late February in Florida. It'll be mid-March. They'll be blooming in Raleigh, hardy in zone 7 to 10. And again, this one just gets bigger than any tag says it's going to get, but it does it in a very layered fashion, and it looks great as it's adding height. It just always looks kind of full and has a great habit to it. And I love the two-tone color. We've seen in the plant breeding now where they're purple all the way down into the bottom, and that looks great on a lot of them. But this one, I actually think because that leaf is so nice, because that older green leaf is actually so nice on this plant. That was already a broken branch. If you're concerned that I'm breaking branches off of things, this purple against this green color really looks fantastic. This is Viburnum tinus. It's a leafy evergreen shrub that has these clusters of white flowers in the spring that are followed by a blackish, kind of metallic looking berry in the fall. And then the older growth is really this dark green, really super dark green foliage. New growth comes out slightly lighter, and the first couple leaves are tinged in this kind of burgundy color. So it's like always doing something. Anytime this plant's actively growing, it's doing something. It's one of my all-time favorite landscape plants. It's not necessarily the easiest plant to grow because it has a tendency to want to bloom way too early. So we're filming this in late February. We're in North Florida, but even here, this is kind of early for this thing to be trying to flower and already have 1.5 inches of new growth on it. I think on the tag, you'll see for Viburnum tinus, it's going to say 4 to 5 feet in height or something. We've seen one that's 8 or 9 feet on NC State's campus where it was really, really old. We filmed that plant in a walk-around video on NC State's campus like last year or the year before. It's a super up-close angle because right next to this big, beautiful Viburnum tinus was a dumpster. So we didn't want to show that it was next to the dumpster. But anyway, really, it's one of those plants that every time I see it, I love the way this plant looks, right? But again, this plant, and I have some frustration because really tough winter up in Raleigh can knock these back a bit before they're, once they have some size and some maturity on them, they're really tough landscape plants. But the first couple of years, they can have a tendency to get burned a bit in the wintertime. One thing I'll say is, so this is Viburnum tinus. And we also have Viburnum davidii in our garden at home, and davidii can be a little bit tricky in the garden. There is a hybrid between tinus and davidii now and on the market. Moonlight lace is the variety that's the named cultivar that it's sold under. That plant is a weirdly kind of a pretty tough ornamental plant. So I take davidii, which can be finicky, and tinus can be a little bit finicky in the garden, crossed them together and got a really tough plant out of them. So if you see that moonlight lace viburnum, that's definitely one worth having. This is red diamond Loropetalum from the Southern Living Plant Collection, and you can see the red color in the flower. So typically we think about these Loropetalum, these purple foliage Loropetalum having pink flowers. This one is much more on the redder side of pink than pink. I think some people might still call it pink, but or red. But this is a super compact growing mid-size Loropetalum. So we've got lots of dwarf Loropetalum that have been introduced over the last few years, and a lot that get 20 feet tall. there's a lot of room between the 3-foot tall ones and the 20-foot tall ones, and this one kind of lands in that sweet spot where I think a lot of people want a larger growing lower petalum but not become a tree ultimately. So this one can be kept around 6 feet in height. Probably it will creep up taller than that in time if you let it, but somewhere in that 6-foot range would be easy to keep it there. We're filming this in March, and typically sometime in March or April in our Raleigh garden is when these Loropetalum will come into full bloom like this. This is a small plant. They'll let this one flush out before they send it out. Foliage is purple year round, zone 7 to 10, and then the flowers come into full flower in the spring on early temperature change. So these come into flower typically before your last frost date, as soon as the ground temperature warms up at all. And then they'll get some residual flowers on them during the summertime, and then typically in the fall come in with a few more flowers than they were doing during the summertime. But really, it's going to have that purple foliage year round, regardless of flowering. You can see they're in that witch hazel family with that little frilly flower that lots of witch hazel plants in that family have. But this is a great variety because I think it finds that sweet spot with a mid-size Loropetalum, where if you need a low screening plant, you don't need something that gets 20 feet tall, you don't want to be pruning on it all the time, this is a good one. Apricot Echo Osmanthus is an evergreen shrub with really nice, shiny, dark green foliage as it matures. It can get, be maintained somewhere probably between 8 and 10 feet in height, but if you just let it go, it's probably going to get more than 15 over time. Apricot Echo has bright orange, small clusters of flowers that are extremely fragrant. These would make great just individual specimen plants, to be kind of the centerpiece of a bed and have smaller things coming, planted down and away from them. And that's kind of what we've done here. It's kind of, it's in the back, and other lower things have been planted. These are very drought tolerant once they're established. Like anything else, when you're putting it in the ground, we're going to have to monitor it. Osmanthus are one of those plants that are very good at telling us they're dry. They'll actually wilt a little bit. Some other things, will just start losing leaves, but these are actually pretty good about letting you know they're dry. When you water it, just drown the space thoroughly and then let it dry out between rains and watering. We want it to go in search of water. And that's pretty much it. They're very pest resistant, just an easy low care shrub that happens to bloom when almost nothing else is blooming, with incredibly fragrant flowers. So this is Apricot Echo Osmanthus. This is Skylight Better Boxwood. The Better Boxwood brand comes from about 20 years of breeding in Europe to find blight-resistant boxwoods. Boxwood blight has been something that's devastated boxwoods around the globe, and Europe had boxwood blight before we had it in the US, and so they worked on it a little longer than we have. And the Better Boxwood brand is the first 4 boxwoods from that breeding program that are scientifically observed to be blight-resistant boxwoods. This is Skylight. Skylight's probably the most versatile of the 4. I'm just going to call it that because it can get 6 to 8 feet in height and 3 to 4 feet in width, but it can be kept pretty much any size that you want to keep it. So we could keep it as a little round ball. We could keep it as a low hedge next to our neighbors where we want something 6 or 8 feet tall. It could go under 3-foot windows and be pruned any way you'd want to prune it. In its natural shape, it's kind of going to be a Christmas tree shape. Again, 6 to 8 feet tall, 3 to 4 feet wide. Hardy in zones 5 to 9. Pretty much adaptable for most soil types, clay, sand, that kind of thing. If you think it's going to be a slightly wet area, you definitely want to elevate it. It doesn't like wet feet, but it'll tolerate slightly moist conditions. In zone 9, probably a part shade situation is best, or at least having the roots shaded just a little bit because they are kind of shallow rooted plants overall. Up in zone 5, the more sun, the better. But again, I think Skylight is incredibly versatile. I think this is a plant that you can use. It's evergreen. It's going to allow blues and white colors to really pop in the garden. It's one of those things that's stable year round, and so you can build the rest of your garden around it. They're deer resistant, rabbit resistant, and just overall very easy plants in the landscape. This is Buxus sempervirens Oreo variegata, otherwise known as variegated boxwood. I'm actually limbing this one up into a little 1-ball topiary. I got another 2-ball topiary over on the other side of the garden, but typically this is a either kept as a low mounding shrub or just allowed to grow in time. It can ultimately get about 10 feet in height and 6, 7, 8 feet in width, something like that if you just let it. But most people are going to control these as kind of low hedges or specimen plants, or have them growing in containers or topiary them, and all the other things that we can do with boxwoods. Typically we're going to have these, boxwoods in full sun, but I would not shy away from having this in partial shade. It really brightens up a shady spot, or a spot where you have long shadows in the garden. Incredibly low maintenance, deer resistant, rabbit resistant, a lot of the things that we look for in a garden plant. They're pH adaptable, so lots of different types of soil types that they can take. Great in sandy soils, great in clay soils, but I do mound them up a bit. Boxwoods tend to be a little shallow rooted, so I keep them mulched well here in the garden, so don't let the sun just beat down on those roots. We got the weeds away from it and that kind of thing. They're hardy in zone 6 to 8, a little less hardy overall with this variegation than some of the straight green boxwoods. When it starts to grow in the spring, the variegation is kind of a bright white edge to it. And then as the season goes on, that bright white settles into kind of a slightly off yellow color on the variegation, filming this between Christmas and New Year's. And you can see what a bright pop of color this is here in our Raleigh, North Carolina garden. But I really love these variegated boxwoods because they're so low maintenance, but they give you this incredible pop of color here in the garden 12 months out of the year. This is Carolina Midnight Loropetalum. It's a very vigorous growing loropetalum that can reach 15 to 20 feet in height, maintainable at more like 8 by 8, something like that, but it'll get as big as you want to let it get. You can allow it to come up and be tree formed, and it has beautiful exfoliating bark in the future. It's evergreen with maroon foliage year round. In the spring, it gets these tassel-like, witch hazel-like flowers on it. They're not fragrant, but they're incredibly showy. Really, really dark pink. In the right light, they're almost red. You'll get these early spring flowers and then residual flowers in the fall. Again, this is a very fast growing plant, very little maintenance on it. It can be used in a mixed border screen. It can be used as just a specimen plant that's allowed to become tree formed. Use it on the corner of a house. They're hardy in zone 7 to 10. All we do is fertilize it in the spring once a year. Weed it, keep the weeds away from it. Becomes extremely drought tolerant in time. Just a great evergreen shrub with this incredible pop of color in the spring and in the fall. This is Highlights arborvita from the Southern Living Plant Collection, or Thuja occidentalis Highlights. This is an eastern arborvita that has this amazing new chartreuse foliage on it, and incredibly resist burning even in warmer areas or bleaching. A lot of times these chartreuse color or lime green colored new growth conifers, during the heat of the summer, they tend to bleach a bit. And I'm filming this right at the beginning of October. And this thing has gone through an entire, now 3 seasons in pretty tough conditions, 10 hours of direct sun on it here in zone 8A in Raleigh, North Carolina, without bleaching, and just looking fantastic here in the garden. These are hardy in zone 5 to 8, but probably more cold hardy than that, probably more like zones 4 to 8. More sun, the more fuller the plant is. It has this upright, narrow habit on it, but we do keep the ground well mulched. We're making sure we're watering our conifers in abnormally dry times, because they're not great at letting us know that they're dry. And so we're making sure if we water it, we're thoroughly watering it and then letting it drain out. This one again is an upright, narrow growing habit. Thuja occidentalis can be sheared into boxwood-like plants, really. So you could keep this 6 to 8 feet in height permanently if you wanted to, by shearing it once a year in the late winter a bit to keep it that size. But if you just let it go, this one's probably going to reach 20 feet in height, maybe 4 or 5 feet in width. Really great corner foundation plant, good container plant for a few years. Great in a mixed border. I typically recommend using different types of plants to create your screen from your neighbor, just in case any plant in your screen has a problem, you don't lose your entire screen. But really great ornamental plant. We have found it to be incredibly sun tolerant and heat tolerant here in our southern garden, and look forward to it growing the rest of the way up the corner foundation in the future. Juliet Claera from the Southern Living Plant Collection, one of our favorite go-to evergreen shrubs. This one leafs out with kind of a maroon foliage during the growing season, during spring and early summer, and then they develop into these variegated creamy white and dark green leaves that looks like every single leaf is individually painted. It's really a very, very striking plant. These will reach something like 8 to 10 feet in height, maybe 4 to 6 feet in width, something like that. You can control it at kind of whatever size you want. Great in a mixed border, mixed hedge, that kind of thing. If you put some darker green things with it, it makes this variegation stand out even more. These are hardy in zone 7 to 10. Moderate to slower growth than some of its green counterparts. These variegated plants are somewhat slower. Full sun is best, and that will keep it its fullest. We've got this one in part shade, and we have to do the occasional little bit of pruning on it because it's trying to stretch on us just a bit. But again, this is a great 4-season plant for anyone's garden. It likes well-drained conditions, so don't put it in a wet space. This is Juliet Claera. This is Frankie Boy arborvitae, or you'll see it listed as Thuja orientalis or Platycatus orientalis is the Latin names for it. This was a seed selection from Austria, normally with Thuja orientalis. You'll see like it's basically little plates surrounding on the outside. It's really interesting growth habit these have, but this one has this like filament style growth, right, in this weeping form. It's really quite striking. It's got yellow new growth that kind of settles into a chartreuse green in the center. Frequently, you would purchase this as a really tight form. There's a lot of pruning that normally goes into these to keep them really tight and compact. But we just like this kind of free form look that it has. I like the red stems on it. I like being able to see it. That little bit of extra pruning though, if you are keeping it in that tighter habit, will probably encourage some additional growth. So you'll see more of this yellow on it throughout the year. Great 12-month plant. I like it in this loose form because it kind of blows around in the wind a bit. Ultimately, it'll reach about 6 feet tall in 15 to 20 years, something like that. 10 to 15 years, let's say 6 feet tall, 4 feet wide. I could shear it much closer than that. These Asian species of arborvitae tend to be more heat tolerant. So this is hardy in zone 5 to 9, where you may see like our native eastern arborvitae being hardy in 3 to 7 or 3 to 8. So much more heat tolerant, and then definitely full sun. Full sun's going to give you the most color, and these really hold up well in the full sun, even in the south. So this one's getting 8-9 hours of direct sun. We keep the weeds away from it. It's in well-drained soil. We keep it mulched, water it when it becomes abnormally dry. And this is a really great plant that's so interesting, and not a lot of other people would have, and everybody will want to know what it is when they see it in the garden, especially when it's actively growing and it has more of this kind of gold coloration on the outside of it. But this is Frankie Boy arborvitae. This is Stellar Ruby Magnolia from the Southern Living Plant Collection. These are hardy in zone 7 to 9. You can see it has an amazing upright, very full habit. This is an evergreen banana shrub hybrid. It gets these mauve, kind of pinkish colored flowers starting in mid-spring. It was absolutely covered in them for a while, and then it will get some more additional flowers throughout the summer and fall. It can reach about 10 to 15 feet in height, maybe 6 to 8 feet in width, something like that. You could definitely do some shearing on it to keep it narrower if you wanted to. It'd make a fantastic screening plant, or as we have it here, is just a one off in the garden where we have other lower things planted around it. It's just a beautiful backdrop. This one was under 3 feet in height when it went in the ground, and now it's 7.5 feet just 2 years later. So pretty fast growing plant. We've got it in about 6 hours of direct sun. It can take sun or part shade. The more sun, the fuller it's going to be. Beautiful, lustrous, dark green foliage year round. This is Stellar Ruby Magnolia.